is Andrew Hetherton. I'm National President of the Institute of Revenues, Rating and Valuation. David is our Chief Executive, and we're going to do a short update on COVID and the impact on the business rate system. In terms of the topic areas, and hopefully you'll be able to see the slide as I've moved through. Looking at COVID support, now a fair number of you will be really thoroughly versed in this, given all the challenges that lots of local authorities have had to put up with over the last several months, in fact. We're also going to cover a little bit about material change in circumstances, the issues around checks and challenges, legal issues, and some valuation issues. And then David's going to move on to the revenue implications, covering spending review, state aid, NDR and support guidance, collection and enforcement, breathing space revenues, VOA and MCCs, and Brexit. So a packed agenda. First of all, I want to have a look at some of the issues around check, challenge and appeal. Now, for many of you, you'll be familiar that the whole approach of this, which was new since 2017, was effectively to bring in a number of changes. The whole system started off with a number of IT issues, which generally seem to have been solved, first of all, by a fix-it team, effectively in HM Treasury and the IT team there. Also, a number of issues around registration. The whole process has been helped by a number of videos and updates being provided by the VOA, and extensive work from the eComs forum looking at how to improve the service. The operation of the VOA portal has been challenging, but it's starting to work. And once the basic system had been put in place, an API, an application program interface, was developed, and whilst lacking in the start, I'm pleased to say that the VOA has continued to work on that process. Just looking back at the system, it was part of a series of measures, as I said, introduced from April 2017, but principally designed to manage the flow of cases via this new digital system. The principle was to identify issues in dispute at an early stage, reduce the number of speculative appeals, and certainly the evaluation tribunal would only consider matters once they've been raised during the process. So introduction of new evidence at an early, so late stage was not going to be acceptable. So all of those changes have sort of been put in place, and they continue to evolve, and we have seen a number of appeals coming through. But first of all, let's just have a look at check. The principle here is to allow the valuation officer to consider the in dispute and to ensure that their records are up to date, and principally to correct factual errors. In fact, if you did have some errors, the valuation office agency would alter the assessment at that point, or indeed if things came to light during the challenge process. In terms of outcomes, the facts to be agreed, the rating list is either confirmed as correct or altered where necessary. If they're not agreed, but points in dispute have been clearly established, then they can be dealt with during the challenge stage. And some of the facts are agreed and the rating list is altered to reflect the correct facts where necessary, and the remaining points are the only ones that go forward to be addressed in the challenge. It's important to remember the timelines. So in terms of progressing to challenge, this happens within 4 months of the completion of the check, or if the check is not completed within 12 months, then it automatically goes forward on that basis. There is an extended period of time of 16 months that's permitted for material change in circumstances. Now, I think it's really important to take into account the fact that the process was designed to try and reduce the number of appeals. So let's just have a look at a number of the statistics. So during the 2017 list, this graph sets the approved property claims. And I think you can clearly see there's a very big spike that comes through in April to June of 2020. Now, the impact of that is that a significant number of properties which hadn't been claimed by that time have been claimed by ratepayers or their agents with a view to making protective material change in circumstances appeals. Looking at the number of challenges and checks that have been registered, you can see that there's a slight time lag, but in terms of checks that have been registered, again, fairly quickly after the properties have been claimed, you see a big spike, June, July and August being the key months. Challenges currently at around 67,000 have been going through, but we're expecting that the red line really doesn't indicate the number that could be at that stage, partly because of some pre-discussions that have been taking place with the Valuation Office Agency, which I'll refer to in a moment. Looking at the checks and challenges resolved, you can see that the Valuation Office Agency has been quick to deal with the checks and to ensure that the cases are cleared. Currently, those that have been resolved, 327,880, but challenges, the clearance on challenges is pretty steady, but doesn't fully reflect the sudden spike that you can see in the graph. Then looking at the numbers of challenges outstanding, you can see that the cases that have happened in terms of challenges has started to increase, and moving through to the challenge stage, there are quite a number of significant cases. Bearing in mind, of course, that the ratepayer or their agents don't, in the case of a material change in circumstances appeal, have to put the details in straight away. They do have that additional period of time. So moving on to some of the legal issues around MCCs, there's been quite a lot of debate about the approach. There's some really good guidance that was provided in two recent cases. The impact is that you really do have to consider what is physically manifest. So Merlin, the roller coaster ride at Alton Towers, and the Wigan football cases, which went to the upper tribunal in 2018 and 19, provide some very good guidance as to the way in which the upper tribunal will consider these matters. There is also an issue around looking at what the attributes are and how they affect the actual occupier. And a leading case on that is Dawkins versus Ash, dates back to 1969. The definition of manifest is referred to in some of these judgments, clearly revealed to the eye, mind or judgment, open to view or comprehension. It needs to be obvious. But it's not correct to restrict it to visual or in any other sense as distinct from a change which is measured or even calculated. So here the upper tribunal was looking at saying, well, you can look at footfall, but you need to be able to put that into context. A really good case that I was dealing with a colleague when I was practicing at GL Hearn was to do with the impact of the opening of the shopping centre in Leicester and the impact that that had on the retail outlet at Foss Park. But the key is that it must be an essential or relevant characteristic in the locality. So in the case of Merlin, the issue is that it was merely an accident, a very tragic accident, that the Merlin roller coaster accident occurred. And the fact that fewer people were attending Wigan and that they were no longer in the higher league was perhaps on the basis that their players had not played as well as others. So some issues around there that no doubt the legal beagles will consider. Another legal issue is what impact does in the locality have? And the upper tribunal looked behind the purpose of paragraph 27D of the General Rating Act 1967. And in the case of Addis, heard by the Court of Appeal, and indeed in the House of Lords. And what is crucial when you consider the matter of COVID is itself the change which is physically manifest in the area. So you can't see it, Can you smell it? Can you touch it? Looking at all of these factors. And then when you come to look at what's happening on the ground, what does the impact have in its locality? So here, again, the considerations have been around looking at the loss of bus services, the fact that pubs, restaurants and other shops are closed, and that might be a factor to consider. The economic factors or intangible matters can cause consequences. In terms of intangible matters, it's the the attitude of shoppers. They're not tangible, but the fact that they are not going out, or where they were told to stay at home, or worried, or indeed because some of them had lost their jobs or didn't have enough money, resulted in something more manifest in the locality. So, for example, consider a petrol filling station located in a prime location. If the impact is not locally driven, then a fall in demand for petrol may not be attributed to local issues. But perhaps because there is a general reduction in demand for petrol, but there are likely to be legal issues in dispute, then that may have an impact. So all of these issues are something that need to be considered. Of course, rating isn't simple. And for many people, it's been called into disrepute, but it's well tried and established. So when looking at economic factors, we need to look at the material day, but substitute that day for the antecedent valuation date. And it's a reminder that the valuation is rooted in the antecedent valuation date world. The matter can be taken back to the AVD, but not the cause. Without the cause, such as legislation or COVID, the matter might fail to bite. So these are all going to be challenges that are going to present challenges for both sides in the negotiations. So looking about the physical manifest at the AVD, at compilation, the valuer takes the physical characteristics of the locality. And remember, for the 2017 list, we're looking at a valuation date of the 1st of April 2015. There's no need to investigate the economic causes, and the regulations do not allow an assumption that these economic factors subsisted at the AVD. But it might be appropriate to investigate what has caused or led to a physical change to see whether the change is truly characteristic of the locality or whether it's simply something accidental. And remember, it's a hypothetical valuation, one for rating purposes, and assumes that the hypothetical parties have, as reasonable people would do if they were transacting for the property in real life, have behaved sensibly. Now, when we come to the use or the occupation of other properties, again, we're looking at the regulations. So para 27E, the use or occupation of other premises situated in the locality of the hereditament. And the issue here is, what's the test? There's no mention of mode or category. Could this include change of use from a hardware shop to a fishmonger's? Is the change an intrinsic characteristic? But importantly, and I think this will become a challenging area, does this include occupied or unoccupied? Is vacancy a use? And how far does it extend? Is the locality from where the evidence is drawn different to the locality where the hereditament is situated? So here you have to think about applying the proper construction to see whether about the locality. And therefore, you couldn't necessarily consider the impact of a manufacturing facility in the Northwest arising from the opening of a new widget producing facility in Japan. It has to be, there has to be some form of causal link. Looking at rateable occupation, is it relevant? Of course, the legislation and the regulations that are being put in place, we need to consider closure by government restriction. Has the mode or category been prohibited from use? So gyms, cinemas and theatres. And on the material day, are the 4 tests of rateable occupation met? So actual, beneficial, exclusive and permanence, or not too transient. And here it's useful to think about the judgment that was handed down in Monk versus Newbigin, where the prior question that was considered was, is the hereditament capable of rateable occupation? Turning to the closure regulations, they required that operations must cease to carry on business. And in fact, it was a criminal offence to continue. But what about vacancy due to administration or liquidation? We've seen in the papers the impact on the retail sector in recent months. The problems being encountered by Debenhams and the like. And what about those premises or businesses that effectively continued to store equipment in the interim? When it comes to looking at valuation, we need to be able to look at comparables. That's the big driver for when you come to have a look at valuation. So let's take, for example, a corner shop. What's the impact on value? Are there some comparable locations nearby? Well, there are likely to be a number of other corner shops, and they will be in the locality. But what happens when you consider something, for example, like the Trafford Centre? What's the impact on value for that? Were there any other overriding factors? For example, the into effect, because obviously into is being placed into administration. And what about the comparable locations? Is it the fact that you can say that White City is a comparable to the Trafford Centre? Certainly in the marketplace, when you come to have a look at the out of town sector, and awards that were determined for rent review purposes, the evidence is drawn from very wide areas. So, for example, B&Q up in North Tyneside, the comparables will be ranging from down to Rugby, down to Plymouth, a whole range of properties being considered to inform the appraiser what the appropriate rent in that instance should be. Of course, we also need to think about the other factors that are going to be coming through, the potential MCCs. So there are a range of factors to consider here. There's scope for confusion and to consider whether it's a feature that's relevant or whether it's just a symptom of the MCC. Ensuring that you characterize the nature and change and look carefully at the effective date. How and when there may be a lessening of impact is also going to be important. So does the removal of cycle lanes, changes to social distancing, changes or reinstatement of public transport, perhaps a lifting of the restrictions, they all are going to be relevant when we look forward to the likelihoods of the success or otherwise of MCCs. And when might they occur, and what's the likely impact going to be on the next revaluation? So the narrative will need to be around the conventional, not the controversial. A really good insight would be is that how do you value, for example, the exhibition Excel Centre out in London Docklands? It's not an exhibition centre at the moment. It's a mothballed Nightingale Hospital. What are you going to do about looking at actual hereditaments and how are you going to put the demand for particular types of properties in context? So in the coming months, there are going to be a number of challenges. Thinking about the statutory duty. Well, whilst the valuation officer has a duty to maintain the rating list, many of you will be aware that they have said that it's subject to their ability to have sufficient resources. And their resources are likely to be focused on the revaluation, dealing with the 2017 revaluation and the MCCs. So going around and altering the list because it has now become out of date is going to have to be factored and prioritised within their workload. What you also need to do is to monitor because as a local authority, and indeed in terms as we see from the figures, is looking through for further checks. Whilst we've got the current checks becoming challenges, it's also potential that further checks are going to be submitted, principally to protect the position of the ratepayer by their agent in many instances. and that will be a challenge. Outcomes from GPCR, well, that's the Group Pre-Challenge Review. So this is a whole approach that is being looked at in preparation for dealing with the MCCs. They've looked at it in a number of areas. But of course, one of the other problems is how many of these are likely to become appeals? Because once a decision notice has been issued, the agent or the occupier has 4 months within which to submit their fee and make the application to the valuation tribunal. And like so many things these days, particularly taking into account that we've had large numbers of cases proceed beyond the valuation tribunal through to the upper tribunal, Court of Appeal, and around 5 cases in the last 3 years that have proceeded to the Supreme Court. Looking at revaluation 2023, the AVD is going to present some real problems because it's going to be set at the 1st of April 2021. So assessing the market value at that point in time is going to be difficult. How does the VOA, indeed any valuer, reflect the positive MCCs prior to the list introduction? Let's just hope that the vaccine works. But is it going to work everywhere? What's its impact going to be on the market? And in fact, is there going to be a market? Because there will be a large numbers of occupiers who are going to be reassessing how they operate in this new world. Other considerations for the Reval 2023 are going to be the impact of a scheme of transitional adjustment, relief or surcharge, and also in terms of how it's going to impact rates retention and council finances. So let's just have a look at the valuation issues for these COVID MCCs, because I think that's where we're going to see some real challenges for everybody in the sector. Looking at the chronology of events, where I know all weary of the continuing problems, but particularly more aware of the initial lockdown and the tiers and then the second lockdown. There's also likely to be a great deal of learning in this area by all parties. And in fact, there's an interesting case, which was the FCA versus Arch Insurance, which is a case that was in the High Court about the impact of COVID. We also need to have a look at the observable consequences. At the beginning, no one knew how long it was going to last. And certainly now, we're not clear how long it will take to roll out the vaccine. At the start, the options were open-ended and resulted in large numbers of claims and checks, as we've seen, being submitted. But it's unclear when we might be back to normal, or indeed whether there's been a permanent change in behaviours or indeed property values. It's possible to quantify the impact. Is it? Or is it artificial? Or indeed practicable to be able to agree a timeline of allowances? And one of the discussions has been around whether an equated allowance is likely. Now, the problem with that is that across sectors, the new norm is applying in different rates. We've seen lots of changes of use of property, changes in intensity of use, increased vacancy, wide variations of footfall and traffic, general reductions in bus and train and airline services, temporary signage, signs on floors, pavements related to social distancing saying keep 2 meters apart, artificial perspex screens that are there to protect us all, employees and customers alike. And across the board, the question will be, how do you put that into your valuation? And importantly, when do you start to take some of these allowances off? And if so, do you take them all off? And do you take them off in stages? So looking at how the system is working, the legislation adopts a broad framework to secure uniformity and fairness between ratepayers. That's the principle of the rating system. The rateable value is the means by which the system achieves those ends. But there is, however, a tension. Fairness requires all hereditaments to be valued to the same yardstick, a single valuation date, and that all hereditaments are valued as they are, a term not used much these days in the court, but rebus sextantibus, valuing it as it stands. And in broad terms, there's a distinction between matters affecting the way an occupier can exploit the hereditament, those affecting the areas in which the hereditament is located, and indeed economic matters. A key feature of the whole of the rating system is how it relates to the antecedent valuation date. So how's it working in practice? Well, discussions with the valuation office have already started. And that partly has been instigated because of the increase in the number of claims and checks. There have been a series of meetings and discussions which are focused on certain classes: high street, offices, factories, workshops and warehouses, education, ad rights, car showrooms, car parks, hospitality, department stores and large shops, airports, transport hubs and sports stadia. Over 240 types have been identified as being subject to numerous MCC appeals. Around 50 property types are covered by the list above. And the GPCR, the Group Pre-Challenge Review Coordination, is being undertaken, but it's focusing initially on those sectors that are not benefiting from the retail, leisure and hospitality reliefs and grants, primarily because those are seen as being the areas which are experiencing significant challenge and have had no support. But that doesn't mean to say that those that have benefited from that relief are not going to see assistance from reductions in rateable value. There are also some problems. How to consider the impact of closure, partly because some stores have continued to trade, perhaps through click and collect, offering takeaway or home delivery. And looking at mandatory closures in the locality, they vary for different types of classes of property. Was it a partial or a voluntary closure? And is time of the essence? Because following the submission of claims and checks, parties have up to 16 months to pull together their evidence to support the challenge. And that, I think, will be the biggest issue, as at what point do you think that you have enough evidence? Because once you've put it in, you're going to struggle to be able to show that there's a reasonable cause for you to add additional information. So understanding the full impact of the regulations and indeed the guidance and its impact on value will be key. There are a number of interesting areas where we've been able to get guidance, partly because of the impact of MCCs and the cases that they related to. So back in 1981, a case called Paul Rocky & Co versus Morley covered the full impact on the material day, and the VO could reinstate having considered the impact of building works, and the full allowance was taken at the material day. The VO had the option to reinstate, and therefore some issues around that case. In the case of Shepherd, again, this was to do with sewer works. There was no presumption of continuance. This was made clear, and there was no presumption on the nuisance continuing to be considered and to be conscious of the actual facts. Key lessons to be learned from that case. In Greenwood versus Harrison, a 1985 case in the Lands Tribunal, it considered the duration and the severity of impact, and this concerned scaffolding and focused very much so on the severity and duration, which is significant. And then a case that's perhaps more recent, which is known as the Pavlo case, and this supported the Greenwood issue and concerned the impact of protesters in the locality of a restaurant, and the effect was so severe that the short-term nature is less relevant and therefore has to be very fact-specific. So there'll be a lot of looking at other or previous cases where we've had valuation issues determined by the courts and tribunals, And the latest word on the ground is that some significant progress has been made, with opinion having been received by both parties, Valuation Office Agency and representative groups of agents, with a view to identifying these differing issues. We're expecting that some progress will be made early in January, and on the areas where they're not able to agree, if they can't, then they will likely run a test case. There are also some further issues, because certainly in terms of how the Valuation Office Agency is going to implement these changes, they will expect ratepayers and their agents, where an agreement for an allowance is made, and for it to be applied to other properties, for those properties to effectively put fresh checks in. So the implications for you, particularly as local authorities, will be to keep a very close eye on the numbers of checks and cases progressing through to challenge in your local authority area in order to be able to assess the impact that this is having. So I'm now going to hand over to David on the revenue implications. So over to David.
Thank you, Andrew. I think you're going to operate my slides for me, so that I'd be very grateful for that. So if you can move me to my first slide, please. Right. Before I start talking about this, I've been listening to Andrew, and of course we have a lot of contact during the year, because he is the president of the institute and he's serving for 2 years, and we discuss matters at great length. And the more I listen to him, the more it's I feel like I'm sort of reading a novel, and it's all about fiction becoming reality. And I get really worried about the overriding principles of the rating system. I'm going to talk about the revenue headlines. I've got a list of subjects that I'm going to address on this, as you can see on this slide. But perhaps before I start, I just want to make a couple of comments, because I think it's worth making those comments so people fully understand what's going on in the marketplace. And by the marketplace, I mean the bigger marketplace, local government, commerce, the whole world, and the way we run our society. Let's just look at one aspect. You may have forgotten, but the rating system is under fundamental review. That fundamental review will report in the spring. I have got no idea what they will say, but when I listen to the way things are moving forward at the moment, particularly with the use of MCCs, and I'll be talking about this and the wider impact in a second, it worries me. Because when you start to look at the fundamental review of a property tax, and I've done this all around the world as well as in the UK, and of course I served on the Barclay Implementation Committee in Scotland, I find myself in a really difficult position, because the rating system, the property tax and the council tax to a lesser extent, and that needs a lot of modification, they are there because they satisfy the basic ingredients of a good property tax. And the key basic ingredients, or the key basic ingredient, tends to be certainty. That you can levy a property tax and you can have some certainty in relation to that yield, and the yield of that levy, and also the collection performance of that levy. With the introduction of an appeal process like check, challenge and appeal, and the use of material changes of circumstance, I believe you're undermining that certainty. Now, whether that's right or wrong, I don't know, because the rating system makes an assumption about the hypothetical tenant. And it's interesting, when you listen to Andrew, again, you could all become, the majority of you on this call are from local authorities. You could become sort of rating experts literally overnight. You could walk up and down your high street and look at the empty shops and look around those empty shops and sort of ask yourself the question, what rent would I pay for that? And generally speaking, at some of the high streets that you see nowadays, you'll pay next to nothing in rent. And of course, that's where we are with this sort of material change in the locality in which you live. And I think the emphasis of what I'm going to say over the next few minutes has got to be linked to your local authority. There are going to be different situations prevailing in different parts of the country, and the decisions you make concerning next year and the remainder of this year will have an effect on the finances of your local authority, will have an effect on the overall financing of local government. But that's got to reflect what's happening in your locality. And remember, as you make these decisions, there are other things that are going on You know, we're talking about the spending review, and we'll be talking about the issues around decision making that hasn't been determined yet, particularly in relation to RHL reliefs and where they are going for next year, and what they have, what's the wider impact of that, particularly on the MCCs, and should they be completely ignored as far as MCCs are concerned. It's going to be interesting to see how these arguments develop. But for more significantly for you, as you start to plan and look forward to the new year, and by plan I mean plan the financial arrangements for your local authority, because your decision making is going to be a major part of that. Your chief financial officers will be looking at the impact on the local authority, and they will be particularly looking at section 114 and considering notices, purely and simply because the financing of local government is in difficulty. You know, that difficulty can be measured in lots of different ways. Was it amusing last week to see that a local authority in difficulty had to pay its photocopying bill by credit card, and they only paid when they were actually challenged legally? That's almost, you know, unthinkable. You know, local authorities paying bills by credit card when you tell everybody, your ratepayers, not to use the credit card. But that's the state of finance. Okay, that was a local authority that's in decline, is going to disappear and be replaced by two unitary authorities. But having said that, it still highlights the challenges that are facing chief financial officers at the moment. And as I talk through these processes over the next few minutes, please bear in mind the impact on your local authority, the decision making that you're going to be participating in over the next couple of months, and the financial viability of your local authority as things change. And looking at the call and looking at the list of delegates, there are people on the call from the whole range of local authorities, from, you know, the biggest local authority in the country, to London boroughs, to metropolitan districts, to unitary authorities, and of course shire districts. And it's, whilst the decisions you'll be making in relation to the collection fund and other matters are common across all of you, because you're covered by the same legislation, the decisions you make will be local decisions, and it will be your professionalism that will be challenged by your 151 officers. And again, I will come back to that in a second. So that theme, this theme of concern, is really running with my slides. So let me look at the spending review. Well, the spending review came. Were there any surprises in the spending review? No, I don't think there were. The multiplier was frozen. Of course, the multiplier was frozen by the Chancellor on the basis of an assumption that he'll have more or less the same income next year as he's had this year. And of course, that's the reality, is that that's not going to be the case. So the whole structure of local government finance has been built around a multiplier for next year that's subject to a freeze from this year that is already being undermined, because that multiplier and its relationship with rateable value is going to be significantly undermined if the rateable value reduces. And if you listen to Andrew, and I have absolutely no doubt that my president is carefully researching all his facts, and he knows this situation back to front. He's been at the sharp end of these negotiations. You've got to listen carefully to what he says. He's saying to you that values could go down. They could go down dramatically, and I will come back to that. There is no flexibility in the multiplier. Well, there isn't at the moment, but of course we could legislate for flexibility. But you could find yourself, local government could find itself in a situation where one of its major sources of revenue is completely and utterly undermined. And that's really difficult. But the spending review's happened. The Chancellor's made his decision. He's frozen the multiplier. And of course, he's made an assumption with his advisors about what the income will be for local government next year. We already know, after listening to Andrew, and if you've got your ear to the ground, that the amount of income that's going to be available next year is going to be less. Never before has it been more important for you to make sure that you have got every value in the list. You know, you need to make sure that you are maximizing your income and maximizing your tax base, because that tax base is under pressure and there is little flexibility. Looking at the reliefs, the reliefs are left on the side. The RHL and the other reliefs, the COVID-related reliefs, were left on the side. The decisions will be made in the new year. And that's the same for Northern Ireland, for Scotland and for Wales. And remember, the three countries are all victims, I suppose that's the right word, of the Barnett formula. They are limited in what they can do in relation to reliefs, and they are generally led by what happens in England. And of course, in England, we had the whole range of reliefs, and the biggest one was RHL, and that cost getting on for £10 billion. It was not a cheap relief. Obviously, if the Chancellor replaces that next year with the same relief or with a slightly modified relief, it'll be much the same bill, although that bill will go down because if Andrew's right, values will go down and therefore the amount of rate liability will drop and therefore the level of relief will drop. But the problem is that the Chancellor has looked at that relief scheme. He wasn't confident enough to put it in place for the spending review. And that confidence was perhaps very wise because in recent weeks, major retailers, the supermarkets, have started giving their relief back to government because they haven't done too badly through the various lockdowns and the various tier activities. That in itself sort of undermines the relief process. You can't have an across-the-board relief, and then the problems really start. And I listened very carefully at our Scottish conference to the man from the Scottish government. He is very transparent and he's a great guy to deal with because every time he opens his mouth, he speaks the truth. And that's a rarity with civil servants nowadays. And I say that with great respect to some good friends of mine who are civil servants. And I know sometimes they are gagged. But he talked about reliefs and he talked about the possibility of having different reliefs for different types of property. That's fine. But the problem with that is once you start to break that relief down, it ceases to be covered by the state aid rules. It doesn't exclude itself from state aid. Of course, state aid may not apply from the 1st of January anyway, because we don't know what the Brexit situation is, and I'll come back to that in a little bit later. And all these things are interlinked. But the reliefs, you just think for a while about those reliefs next year. Those reliefs have created a situation where nothing has had to be paid for the last year through those properties within those three descriptions. Next year, there will be some relief, but how far will it go? What will be the range of reliefs? What will be the impact to have gone from people who've been paying no rates to having to pay rates? That relief decision that the Chancellor is going to make early in January or early in the new year is critical. He's got to make it before the 31st of January for reasons that you already know. But it's going to be interesting to decide how he makes that decision. In the spending review, he touched upon rate retention. He looked at the 100% pilots and said they're going to continue. And of course, the general rule of rate retention continues. The law still stays the same. So we still have the same arrangements that we had for last year. Nothing has changed there. For council tax, again, this impacts on business rates, purely and simply because it has this effect on the deficit in the collection fund. The council tax is the funding vehicle that has or had some flexibility. Obviously, it's being attacked by various sort of things that diminish the tax base, particularly reduction schemes. And there's lots of debate around the reduction schemes and their overall impact. But of course, there's been the bigger hardship fund. And in the spending review, the Chancellor said there's going to be another hardship fund for the coming year. That was an absolute must do. There is no way that he could have taken that money away. But of course, he also, in the lead up to the spending review, they put in place the 1.99% referendum limit. So therefore, that's effectively a cap. And it's like turkeys voting for Christmas. How many council taxpayers are going to vote with the way their incomes have been going over the last year for an increase in their council tax next year? None. So anyone who goes over 1.99% and leaves themselves open to a referendum are in serious difficulty. But the problem with that, because the council tax is your flexible spender, the thing that finances and supports your general fund, you are in a real difficulty there because you haven't got any flexibility. So the spending review is really almost a sort of a snapshot at a point in time. The situation will change as we go into the new year, and it will be interesting to see if we see a spending review Mark II around about April, May time, particularly because by then, local authority 151 officers will be looking at their budgets and wondering how they're going to deliver services for the forthcoming year. Can you go to the next slide, please, Andrew? State aid. We've had various notices in the last week about state aid. They haven't changed much. basically you had some revised guidance, and the revised guidance modified the ceilings. We know that we've got the state aid ceiling was increased to 800,000 euros, and then we've had this €3 million ceiling put in. But they are just overall figures modifying the limits at which, the limits up to which state aid can apply, and putting things within the state aid bracket. The reality is that state aid is going to stay much the same, providing the schemes stay the same. If the schemes change, and I'll come on to this in a second, state aid may not apply. But of course, state aid is affected by Brexit. We don't know what the state aid rules are going to be after the 31st of December. So we are in this period of uncertainty. And of course, if we have no deal, what happens to state aid? Does it literally overnight stop? What is the impact of that on the overall economy? And these are decisions that I can't make. I'm not Chancellor of the Exchequer and I'm not Prime Minister. But over the next couple of weeks, as the things begin to sort of roll out and we get nearer to the 31st of December, we've got to keep a close eye on the impact of a no deal and what that would mean to the overall picture of local government finance. Can you move to the next slide, Andrew, please? So currently, we've got the 12-month business rates holiday for all retail. But what if that scheme changes? I already said that the spending review was silent. But what happens if the scheme becomes a selective scheme by class of property? The rule that's determined that the retail relief, hospitality and leisure relief was not state aid was because it was available to all. If it becomes selective, does it then cease to have the benefit of state aid? That's if state aid continues after the 1st of January. What about if the scheme becomes a selective scheme linked to profit or class of property? Where does that put you as local authorities? You're already up to your neck in grants. You've most likely, grant is now most likely the most unpopular word in local government. When the government have a problem with COVID, they will introduce a grant scheme. And they've got those mugs in local authorities to administer it for them. And I mean saying mugs with great respect, because I'm amazed by the way that local authorities have responded to this. The civil service government could never have delivered the grant schemes with the efficiency that local authorities have delivered them. I've been on all the calls, I've listened to the arguments, I've looked at the advice, we've given advice as an institute, and it's really quite amazing how local authorities have responded to it, how local authorities have delivered those grants. We're talking about local authorities all across the country delivering 98% of the grants efficiently. There are always going to be the 2% of people that are fraudulent and various other things. But the problem is that if the relief schemes change and become selective, and it's not easy to have a selection by class of property, if you link it to turnover or to profit, that involves you immediately as local authorities. You will have to award the relief. That will be subject to some kind of test. If it's not going to be subject to a test, why did the Chancellor not put it in the spending review? There is absolutely no doubt in my mind that he's looking at it in a different way. And I think his search for a solution has been hardened by the offering of the money back by the major, particularly superstore retailers, Tesco's and the like. Tesco's got in first and they said, we're going to give our money back to the government because we've been doing very nicely. Immediately, it puts a spotlight on all reliefs, because if you want to do that, the small business rate relief is a classic regressive relief, where if you're running a small business and it's floundering, you get the relief. If you're running a small business, it's a great success, you get the relief. Hopelessly regressive. Let's introduce schemes that make these schemes less, ideas or approaches that make these schemes less regressive. But there is a real issue here about the future of the relief scheme for RHL. And of course, the impact for you day to day on the ability to pay next year. You cannot put a retailer, you cannot put a private business in the RHL categories that are going from not paying a tax bill to paying a tax bill. There won't be there might be a transition scheme. You never know. You have no idea what the Chancellor is going to come up with. I have no idea. I've not seen any leaks. One assumes the civil servants are talking about it and looking at it, but it really is a very, very significant issue. I think I'll park it there because I say more about it, and the more you think about it, the more complex it becomes. But watch this space. This decision has got to be made early in the new year, so you are fully aware of it before you do your planning for next year. Next slide, please, Andrew. The NNDR1. The NNDR1 is on the way. You know it's coming out on the 18th of December. It's a slightly revised form. I was a little bit disappointed to see that our friends at CIPFA, and I'm a member of CIPFA, are running an event this week. They are advisors to the government. They have a contract with the government to advise them on the accounting side of this. And I think it's slightly naughty from one professional body talking about another for them to run a commercial event in the few days before it becomes public. Because when this form becomes public on the 18th, and when you see the guidance on the 18th, you will see that it's a slightly revised form. The form obviously has got to take account of the collection fund deficit at the 31st of March 2021 that's going to be recovered over the 3 years, and you'll be required to forecast that. That's a new section 4A in the form. But apart from that, the form is more or less what you've seen before. It's nothing new, and I must admit the guidance notes that support the NNDR1 are excellent, and that excellence continues. Again, the Institute, we had sight of these only because they were sent to the software houses as well. And the suppliers, I'll rephrase that, not to the software houses, they were sent to the software suppliers group that is run by local authority representatives of the software suppliers. I'm afraid MHCLG still don't talk directly to the software suppliers, which I think is a grave mistake, particularly with all these reliefs and responses. I'm sure that if there was a constant dialogue with the software suppliers directly, we would not be in this frustrating situation from time to time where it takes a while for the software to come out. But that's another story, and that's a subject of another discussion, no doubt. But looking at the NNDR1, got to be filled in by the 31st of January. And that's why this lead up to the 31st of January is so critical. The challenge for you is going to be what Andrew's been talking about, the MCCs and the impact on your local authority, and what your provision is going to be for next year. And the challenge, for Analyse and for Inform will be helping you with that decision making. And that is not an easy decision. I'm going to come back to that again in a second. We've already been warned about the fire stations and hospitals. Of course, the other factor here is your collection performance and exactly how that's going to go. It's interesting that the rules on the deficit and allowing you to repay your deficit over 3 years rather than next year. And of course, you haven't got much flexibility to pay it because you haven't got very many sources of revenue. But do they honestly think that you're not going to be in exactly the same position next year? By they, I mean MHCLG. This solution is not a sensible solution because next year the collection fund will be in deficit unless you make some brave decisions about your forecasting, and that will be a matter for you and your 151 officer. But the reality is that the collection fund will be in deficit next year, subject to your forecasting, and of course it could be in deficit for the following year. They're going to continue giving you a 3-year cycle, 3 years on 3 years on 3 years. The Institute came up with a much better solution. We put to them a guaranteed income scheme, similar to what they have in Scotland, where the local authorities know they're going to get their income and they get it. Same in Northern Ireland. England and Wales are suffering. So in local government terms, in Scotland and Northern Ireland, you have certainty of income because it's a guaranteed income. In England and in Wales, you don't. You have the problem of the collection fund and collection fund deficits, and that's surfaced this year as a major difficulty. That's why you've been given the 3 years. I can't see that just being an issue for this year. I think it will be an issue for next year, the year after, and who knows, possibly the year after that. But the NNDR form and its supporting guidance will be with you on Friday, and it's a good read. Collection performance. Obviously, your collection performance for next year has got to be forecasted. You've got to sort of say how you're going to perform. How long is a piece of string? Look at your collection performance in business rates for this year. You know how things are going. It's been difficult, and you get a very wide range of performance statistics coming out, and you've been reporting those to MHCLG. Obviously, they have been affected by the various COVID schemes that the government have come out with, and particularly RHL, the relief. There's a big chunk of ratepayers who have not had to pay. Already, I've talked about the prospects for next year. What are the prospects for next year? We've no idea at this stage. No idea at all as far as the reliefs are concerned, or the reliefs associated with COVID. But what we can be certain is that there will be challenges against liability. How will you cope with those challenges against liability? For example, MCCs, you know full well there's going to be a subject to a series of challenges, and I'm going to come back to this a little bit later. But what will be the impact on the revenue that you collect? What about the retrospection of the MCC? Because it's going to go back into the current financial year. Andrew talked about some decisions being made in January. Will they come through to you? Will they be made in time? Is the Valuation Office and the private sector valuers, a lot of whom are Institute members, aware of the critical nature of an MCC indication being given during January, so that you can actually forecast provisions accurately? They're required for the collection for the NNDR1. So it's going to be hard. And then, of course, there are other challenges in liability, which I'll come back to in a second. Then there's the issue around empty rate. And again, Andrew began to touch on that, about looking at the different circumstances. The whole 4 basic ingredients of rateable occupation, and where do they stand now with the prohibitions that we have in relation to COVID? You know, have the large office blocks in London that are largely empty of people but full of equipment just become storage areas? Will that material change of circumstance and value take the value of those properties down to virtually nothing? And again, I will come back to that in a second. But what about the arguments about whether they're occupied or not? What about the definition of beneficial occupation? Looking at historic case law, case law has never dealt with anything like COVID. You've never dealt with a pandemic. You've never dealt with an overall situation that's affecting every local authority and every occupier of every property in the area. It undermines the stability of the property tax. And of course, if you deem that these places, these buildings are not in beneficial occupation and they become empty, how easy is it to just exclude yourself from liability if you're a ratepayer for empty rate by using the exemptions? The exemptions are there. The actions of public authorities are known to you all. There's plenty of case law in these areas. So it really puts a big question mark over liability for next year. And your understanding of rating law will be challenged. It will be challenged at every level, whether it be at the initial liability when the bill goes out, your determinations on any reliefs, who knows what those reliefs are going to be. It's really going to be difficult. And a good professional challenge, but it might give you the odd sleepless night. And then, of course, we have insolvency. The impact of insolvency is being cushioned. You're being cushioned from the problems of insolvency. You may or may not be aware, but the Corporate Insolvency and Governance Act of 2020 and the associated regulations have virtually taken the sting out of people of insolvency. There's a statutory moratorium. So if you tried to make someone insolvent, you would be in difficulty. There's a restructuring. There's a section in the Act on restructuring plans. There's a section in the Act on termination clauses, where traders are faced with termination clauses from suppliers and challenging the legality of those in the COVID situation. There's a suspension of wrongful trading, something that lots of you have been using over the years, particularly in relation to bankruptcy. And only last week, there was another set of regulations extending the protection of tenants in relation to eviction from their commercial premises. You know, these regulations associated with the 2020 Act are very active and will become active in the new year, more active in the new year, and will affect your revenue. And of course, this all is delivered around this forecasting challenge that you have. Forecasting challenges in relation to that NNDR1. The majority of the NNDR1, as you know, is self-populating. But it's the questions that you have to populate that are the challenge. And those challenges are very, very real. You will have to sit down and talk very carefully with your 151 officer about the impact on your local authority. The government will have to look very carefully at the rate retention scheme. There are lots of problems cropping up that have not been addressed as yet. Andrew and I had a discussion off the record with senior officials to talk about our concerns about this. And really, there were major concerns about how this is going to impact this potential of a massive reduction in value. And again, I'll come back to that in a second. The enforcement process. Move on to the next slide, Andrew, because the enforcement process is the next slide. You're all suffering difficulties. Some are suffering more than most with the magistrates' court and the impact of those courts being virtually sort of closed down and virtual hearings and the like. But again, the problem here is that access to the magistrates' court is difficult. But when you get to the enforcement process, I think getting the liability orders might prove to be difficult as well, particularly if people really want to challenge. But then you have to ask yourself, what teeth have those liability orders got? For those who don't know, the taking control of goods freeze or restriction has been extended now to the 11th of January. This was slipped in the last couple of weeks. So you know, you're one of your major enforcement tools is being taken away from you, taken away from your enforcement agents for the time being. We have the introduction of breathing space and the statutory debt repayment plan. The Institute ran some very successful seminars last week on this. Breathing space will be with you on the 4th of May, and I will mention this again in a second. And the statutory debt repayment plan has not been fixed yet. Remember, this will affect business. Generally speaking, it won't obviously affect the limited liability in the companies and the corporate bodies, but it will affect the sole traders and the self-employed. You have the insolvency issues that I've already mentioned and the new Act. Then the potentials for challenge and you know, challenge in whatever level. And there could be new challenges. Who knows where they are? What about your hardship decision making? What about write-offs that you might be wanting to make? All of those are discretionary decisions. They're decisions that impact upon your revenue. And those decisions are difficult ones. And, you know, where is the case law coming from to say that local authorities in financial difficulty can't afford to make discretionary decisions in favour of ratepayers? Would that be fettering the discretion? Lots of case law on that. We're in a new territory. This is a different a unique situation we've never been in before. I've already mentioned the taking control of goods. That's being restricted. Move on to the next slide, please, Andrew. This is just firming up some of the stuff on breathing space and the SDRP and insolvency. 4th of May is the implementation for breathing space, and people are saying, oh, you know, what effect is it going to have? It might only be minor. It may only be minor. But the reality is it's given people a 60-day moratorium. It could have a 60-day impact on your cash flow. We have no idea. The decision making on the implementation of a breathing space moratorium is made by a debt advisor. As far as business rates are concerned, it's only going to affect the self-employed and those non-corporate bodies. But having said that, it's a piece of legislation. It's another part of the jigsaw puzzle that you'll be wrestling with over the coming year. So you're looking at the impact on the business rate as a tax, the impact on the business ratepayer. But obviously, you're just looking at the individual. As I've said already, you've got the moratorium, the 60-day moratorium, and the cash flow challenge. The role of the statutory debt repayment plan is a big issue. The government are holding back on that. It is a manifesto. It's a manifesto commitment of the Conservative Party. It was in 2 manifestos. They are not going to go away from this, but the whole introduction of a statutory debt repayment plan with debts repayable over a period of up to 10 years, that's what the policy proposals say, create numerous problems for local authorities, particularly in the recovery of council tax, but more so in the recovery of all their other debts. And when you look at this, the breathing space, and you say, oh, breathing space doesn't affect your decision making. Remember, breathing space impacts on your trading debt as well. So all that 15–20% of local authority income comes from trading debt in some authorities. That will be impacted by breathing space. The amount of income, the loss of income, the delay in cash flow. We have got an interesting set of provisions to manage for the forthcoming 12–24 months. And of course, as I've already said, the various insolvency remedies. Move on, Andrew, please. Next slide. This is an extract from a piece from the chief valuer on LinkedIn. I thought I'd start with this before I start to talk about value. And this is word for word. I've taken it straight from LinkedIn. We We are really pleased to be making progress on the valuation and legal principles for resolving the material change of circumstance challenges arising from the pandemic, as Andrew's told you this morning. Colleagues at the Rating Surveyors Association, I'm a member of the Rating Surveyors Association, and other industry representatives have provided valuable insight during these discussions. Detailed analysis of some specific property sectors has commenced and should enable us to make good progress and reach a swift conclusion. Additional property sectors were identified for immediate discussion, and these will start over the next few weeks. My thanks to the VOA and private sector colleagues for their endeavour and collaborative approach thus far. Right, where's the local authority in that? The local authority is not party to valuation decisions, a massive mistake made a couple of years ago. But more significantly, the property tax deals with the distribution of the tax. That's what it does. It doesn't do anything else. The rateable value, as Andrew quite rightly says, distributes the tax. The local authority should be party to these decisions. The local authority should have the ability to challenge these decisions. That ability has been taken away. This is dealing with the distribution of a tax. The ultimate customer for the rating system is the local authority. The taxpayer, I suppose, is a victim of the system. The surveyor is an advisor for the taxpayer. But the system is there to finance local government. The rating system, the individual rating values deal with the distribution of that tax, and as Andrew quite rightly said, determines whether it's fair. Fine statement from Alan Colston, and Alan is a first-class guy, and he is incredibly helpful and transparent in his dealings with people. But it's just the principle is he can't do anything about it, but I just feel that this is highlighting the removal of the interest of the local authority in valuation matters was damaging and continues to be damaging. Move on to the next slide. I've had my rant on that for the morning. So let's look at the potential revenue impact. Andrew's outlined very clearly, and I hope you've been listening to him carefully, about the potential volume of cases. You know, the reality with this situation is that every property in the list could be affected by a reduction in value as a result of MCC. Okay, we've had the Tesco's action of repaying the relief, saying we're doing very nicely. So it's going to be a little bit of differential sort of impact. Having said that, looking at the overall rental values, the rental market is undoubtedly going to be affected by COVID, and has been affected by COVID. As I've said, walk down the high street and ask yourself, what rent would you pay for that empty shop? Next to nothing, most likely. But you've got to look at the local impact. See, this is a local decision for you because you've got to make a provision locally. You take advice from the professionals, from the Analyse guys, and from Inform, but those professionals are going to reflect your local situation. You've got to reflect that local situation. You've got to look at the potential loss of value within your local locality. So it's going to be a different pattern across the country, depending what type of local authority you are and where the majority of your rateable value rests. This makes fire stations and hospitals pale into total insignificance because the potential loss here could be considerable. We could be talking, if you look at it realistically, what would be the rental bid? Would it reduce by 10%? That doesn't sound like it's enough. 20%? That doesn't sound like it's enough. 30%? That doesn't sound like much either when there's no trading pattern in the high street, or factories are closing, or offices are closed. So we get to 40%, then we get to 50%. And these are massive figures. And I think the loss of revenue is going to be in that region. How you measure that is a challenge for individual local authorities. You should take whatever professional advice you can. And for those professional advisors, you need to look at the marketplace and the locality. Again, Andrew talked about locality in his presentation. That loss of revenue, if that value is reduced, is going to be a retrospective loss for this year, and of course a loss for next year, and no doubt the year after, until, as Andrew said, those allowances will be taken off. Are they taken off immediately? Do you take them off in stages? How long does it take the market to recover? These are massive challenges. What are the medium to long-term effects of this? And then, as Andrew's quite rightly said, the next revaluation and the antecedent valuation date. It sits right in the middle of a property market that most likely won't be recovering by then. This is a massive problem, and you've got to forecast this accurately. You've got to forecast this by the 31st of January. There are so many unknowns in this area. The challenge is enormous, and your 151 officers have got to listen to you. You've got to listen to the advice given to you by your professional experts as well. Can we move on to the next slide, Andrew? Rate liability and case law, but we've just been talking about value. What about rateable occupation? I touched on it, the 4 basic ingredients. What challenges are they going to be? Do we need a new healthy challenge of beneficial occupation? I'm certain it will come, and I suspect it will come in central London and in the city. I noticed that we've got representatives of the city on the call. I suspect they're ready for the challenges on what constitutes rateable occupation in a pandemic. And then, of course, the weakness of empty rate and how vulnerable it will be to challenges. These are things these are bread and butter for you rating practitioners. But having said that, there are so many opportunities for challenge on the liability side. You've just got to brace yourself for them. And let's just look at a few examples. Rates avoidance, the special purpose vehicle. At the moment we've got the Rossendale case, the Wigan case, going to the Supreme Court. We're waiting for a decision. Let's just assume the Supreme Court support that decision and the SPV becomes absolute law. The special purpose vehicle, they've only just touched on it. When you look at the Westminster case and the tax avoidance cases back in the 30s, they were all built around the early days of special purpose vehicles. Goodness knows what this is going to mean. And then, of course, you have rates avoidance linked to COVID-19 masking. And this is a play on words. It's not the mask you wear. It's masking occupation, using COVID-19 as an excuse when it really isn't an excuse, creating situations. These will be challenges that will crop up every day in your decision making as far as the business rate is concerned. You've not felt the real impact of it yet because we haven't seen the changes in value. We haven't seen the impact of the MCCs. We haven't seen the wider impact of sending bills and people having difficulty in paying bills, although we're beginning to see it now. But it really is quite a challenge for next year about rate liability and property descriptions and everything else. Of course, the issue here on rate liability and property descriptions, just in passing, it's worth reading the filed case, Atos IT Services versus Filed Borough Council, where occupation wasn't in accordance with the description in the list and the method of recovery used by the ratepayers representative to get their money back and the difficult position it put the local authority in. These cases are worthy of sort of study before you get into the new situation for next year. And then, of course, you have the methods of valuation and the impact on liability. The Exeter City case, the museum case, where a property, the R&E method of valuation, and Exeter City Council, the Exeter Museum, went from having a value to no value at all because of the method of valuation. These cases, 3 cases there that are really worthy of your attention. Next slide, please, Andrew. Brexit. Well, I've touched on Brexit. I've looked at the wider issues in my sort of rambling about state aid. It does depend on deal or no deal. It really, if there is a deal, to what extent will state aid figure in that deal, and will there be any modification, particularly as the government continually keeps talking about our sovereignty, the fact we're a sovereign country. But if there's no deal, does state aid go completely out of the window? The wider issues there, and of course, another issue that will affect you is the procurement rules. What's going to happen after Brexit in relation to procurement rules? I just put that in because, it's just another issue. But there are so many threads in Brexit to local authority service delivery. It really is difficult. But the big impacts for you immediately will be state aid and the issues around state aid, and of course the government's future intentions on with regard to the reliefs, the wider impact on local government, and of course that's already testing the minds of the 151 officer. Will it be another trigger for a 114 notice? What about the grants that come from Europe? Will they be backed by the government? There's no clear picture at the moment of these. And I'm now talking about the Institute as a company. I was only talking to my team and to Daniel Drain in particular last week, and he was saying it's ridiculous. He said every time you go to try and get advice, particularly on issues like VAT, you get referred to the websites, and the websites are just not saying anything at the moment. So there's going to be a lot of impact of Brexit with no deal, massive impact, but there will be impact with a deal, but because we don't know the detail of that deal, although the papers are out there for us to look at. And what effect will it have on the non-domestic rate? How will the Chancellor look at this? You know, the wider impact. And I put there very mischievously, could it be another material change of circumstance? You know, are our friends, the rating surveyors, waiting, you know, with their fresh checks in relation to Brexit? Who knows? I think that's me done, Andrew. I can't recall. Did I add another